Good evening, everyone. My name is Ritvika Sharma, and I'm a senior resident fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, where I lead our Constitutional Law Center, which we call Charkha over here. I welcome you all today to the 11th edition of Vidhi's book, Adda, and I'm delighted to have with us today Dr. Achyut Chetan, who is an associate professor of English at the St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. Achyut's doctoral research focused on the missing mothers of the Indian Constitution and the gender politics of its framings, which he did at the English department of the Vishwa Bharati Shanti Niketan. Achyut has taught marginalized students of Santhal Parganas for several years. He has, of course, authored Founding Mothers of the Indian Republic, Gender Politics of the Indian Constitution, which is a book published by the Cambridge University Press in November last year, and which is the subject of our attention at today's book, Adda. Achyut, thank you very much for taking out time for us today, and we're delighted to have you with us for the book, Adda.
Thank you so much, Ritika, and thank you, Vidhi, Center for Legal Policy, for inviting me to talk about it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Achyut.
It's indeed a pleasure.
Thank you. I'll just take a minute to briefly introduce our viewers to the book, and then we can just jump straight into this discussion. So the book, Founding Mothers of the Indian Republic, as Achyut mentions in the closing sentence of the last chapter of the book, is an invitation to unforget the founding mothers. The book compels us to bring to our attention the women members of the Indian Constituent Assembly, and it traces their interventions on specific issues and specific provisions in the Constitution. And it eventually also situates these interventions in the larger trajectory of Indian feminism. In the process, the Founding Mothers, the book, is also trying to undo the prejudices attached with the phrase founding fathers. And I feel me as a lawyer and a lot of us constitutional researchers are routinely guilty of alluding to the founding fathers on occasions more than one, while not really talking about the founding mothers as much. For the benefit of our viewers, I feel, Achyut, I think it's a little important to take a quick moment to mention what the Constituent Assembly is, because that's the body that was central to drafting of the Constitution, to the framing of the Constitution. So I'll just take about 30 seconds to go through that. So the Constituent Assembly was a body comprising indirectly elected representatives from both the British Indian provinces as well as the princely states. And this body was tasked with framing and drafting the Constitution of India. It had several specialized committees that were formed under it. The Assembly deliberated for nearly 3 years before it gave India her constitution. And most people would be aware of the more prominently known members of the Assembly, such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the chairperson of the drafting committee, or Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who was the president of the Constituent Assembly. What routinely escapes our attention is the presence, and a very vocal presence at that, of the women members, and 15 of them out of a total of 389 members. So with that caveat out of the way, I think we can jump straight into a discussion on the book. I would also like to request members of our audience to keep typing in their questions in the chat box. And Achyut, perhaps when you've spoken for about 30 to 35 minutes, we can take some questions from the audience. So when I saw this book, Achyut, I was, of course, very intrigued, and there was very little time between the time when the book came out and actually eventually bought it. So I can obviously not speak for people across various disciplines, but as a lawyer and as a legal researcher working on the Constitution and constitutional law, I think I may have a fair understanding of where our amnesia towards the women members in the Assembly sort of comes from. So as lawyers, most times we tend to approach constitutional law research in a very issue-specific fashion. So we pick out issues, perhaps like judicial appointments or working of local governments. We zero in on a certain issue, and while comprehensively researching it, we will obviously look at the Constituent Assembly debates to ascertain what the framers of the Constitution said. So while doing that, we tend to look at the Assembly as one unit, as one entity, perhaps like a monolith speaking in one voice and not in the specific voice of the members. And on many issues, on many occasions, the individual voices of the members may not have been deemed as important, maybe perhaps for our research. I'm definitely speaking for one lawyer, that is me, and not for everyone else. What I would really like to ask you was, in your work on this book, could you come across any factors that contributed to the amnesia on the part of historians and perhaps political scientists when they spoke about, when they were discussing the framing of the Constitution?
Thank you for asking that question, Vidhi. It will require a lot of, I'm not a law student, so I am not really be able to tell why lawyers or legal historians have not focused on on the founding mothers or on the members of the Constituent Assembly. But I think even if I am not a student of law, I think because I had to go through a lot of works on the Constitution, one of the major blindness comes from the fact that people who study Indian Constitution hardly refer to its sources. And when they refer to the Constituent Assembly debates also, they focus only on the Constituent Assembly debates, which is a large corpus of
Right.
printed, volumes of the speeches delivered by members of the Constituent Assembly on the floor of the Constituent Assembly. And that too is done, as you yourself said, when you want to look for a particular reference. So in that case, somehow or the other, for 70 long years, when they started looking for these quilt quotations or relevant quotations, they never met any quotation from the women, or even when they did not even notice that these women could probably be working together with other women. So that is one way in which legal historians have probably been blind to this. Political scientists, I'm very surprised myself as to why they did not look at it. But one reason is, as Sumit Sarkar probably mentions, is that political scientists begin reading the Constitution or reading about the development of political structure of India after 1950. So 26 January 1950 onwards, whatever happens is something that they look at. Historians stop somewhere on around 15th of August 1947. So this period between 15th of August 1947 and 26th January 1950 falls in a kind of a shadow, and people do not really work on them. A lot of intellectual energy has actually been taken up by study of the partition, which also is a surprise because there is a direct relationship between the partition and the constitution making of India, something which people have only recently started looking at. So that could be one reason why there has been an amnesia around it. But uh, I have a more speculative and more personal reason why I feel this did not happen, and I use the word unforgetting uh, these women members because I think the hold of the metaphor founding fathers has been so strong in public imagination in India. We are a patriarchal society, and there's no doubt about the fact that men have made major contributions to the founding of the Indian Republic. But somehow or the other, the founding fathers, the image of the founding fathers, the brilliance of people like B.R. Ambedkar and Nehru and Rajendra Prasad and the political acumen of people like Patel, and also, since you talked about the Constituent Assembly as a body that framed the Constitution, somewhere we associate, you are yourself a lawyer, which is a very pleasant, uh, change. And that is something that I believe the women members of the Constituent Assembly must have looked forward to. But we think that the making of the Constitution was a task entrusted to lawyers. And we do not generally assume that there were many women lawyers capable of, drafting something like the Constitution between the period 1947 and 1950. So that probably was one reason. Uh, More than that, I think there has been an entrenchment of the idea of the founding fathers in our legal discourse itself. So if you look at Supreme Court judgments, time and again, the judgments refer to the founding fathers or the wisdom of the founding fathers, whether it's the important judgments which have changed which are landmark judgments, or even smaller judgments or judgments of less value. Finally, I think there is one major reason why women have been forgotten, like for all other reasons, because we do not have faith in this notion that women can also found something. As Carol Pittman brilliantly says in the Sexual Contract, we assume in our patriarchal discourses that it is for men, for women, they can just give birth to children, but men give birth to nations, and men give birth to, ideas and disciplines and so on. So that prejudice has long been there, and it has definitely inflected the constitutional discourse. Added to that is, of course, the fact that Indian women, the one that I really work on, had an attitude of self-effacement. They would not really claim that we are the founding mothers or we also wrote the Constitution of India. So these are probably the reasons why we have never been able to look at the founding
In,
mothers.
In fact, on the last point that you just mentioned, Achyut, and this is again drawing from something that you mentioned in your book also, that the Constituent Assembly by itself was a largely masculine body, while the committees, which I'll come to in a bit, are the ones where women's contribution was more prominent. I think even there, I think somewhere you mentioned that some women had very categorically mentioned that they were rather conscious about speaking in a gathering, which is largely consisting of men. I think a lot of what you just mentioned sort of ties back with that also. But you'd also spoken about what sort of period historians in political science are starting their analysis from in some parts. In which case, I am also very intrigued. I'm very interested to know about where the core of the women's politics, particularly the women members' politics, was coming from, and how it drew in particular from the All India Women's Conference, which as our viewers might know, was an organization founded in 1927. It was meant to improve educational efforts for women and children, and it also expanded its scope to tackle many other issues. The reason I'm particularly mentioning the All India Women's Conference is because many of the prominent, most vocal women members of the Constituent Assembly, were also part of the All India Women's Conference. So how did the members get influenced by the conference's ideas concerning the relationship between the individual and the state? So if the constitution can be called the modernizing force, which sort of reformed, which ushered in very many reforms concerning the women's movement, how much was it actually drawing from the All India Women's Conference?
A lot of it actually. So I call it the constitutional politics of the women's movement. So
Right.
women's movements all over the world have various strategies, and they participate in picketing, they participate in all kinds of strategies. But one particular method that I believe the All India Women's Conference championed was the method of constitutional politics, which involved writing a lot of petitions, writing or submitting memorandum, doing fact-finding researches, creating a kind of corpus of written documents, and making putting a pressure on both the nationalist leaders and the colonial rulers, both through these written documents. So what happens? We are talking about shadows today. We're talking about why women were not remembered. So I would speculate that the Indian nationalist movement had very spectacular figures. So we had the figure of Gandhi, who leads a Dandi march, and thousands of people follow him. On the other hand, we have people like Subhas Bose, right, who leads an army altogether. And then there are the revolutionaries who take up arms against the British. And all of these are very spectacular kind of heroic kind of modes of revolutions or changes that they wanted to bring in. But constitutional politics is not something that is quite as much visible in the same way as these other kind of politics is. It's something that you do in your drawing rooms. It's something that you do by writing petitions, by doing researches quietly, by drafting a kind of a petition with demand A, demand B, demand C, circulating it among members who are important in the Indian legislatures, who are important members to the Viceroy's Executive Council, or maybe important civic bodies, civil society places, and so on. So this is not something that would draw attention of so many people. But this is something that actually prepared members of the All India Women's Conference for the rule that they finally essayed in the Constituent Assembly. So they were already well versed in the language of the Constitution. This is also, since you asked that question about AIWC and its evolution. So one of the things that I sense was happening between, say, 1927 and 1947 is that the members of the All India Women's Conference were gradually started appropriating the language of constitutionalism. Speaking in the language of fundamental rights, speaking in the language of exceptions to rights, and so on and so forth. They were changing what I call the moral imagination or their own vocabulary into the language of constitutionalism. In the course of doing this, they started speaking for the interests of women, and they were talking about the interest of women to a number of organizations. So that is something that they did, and that prepared them for this role that they have played. That also helped them create a very robust imagination of what kind of nation state they want once the British have left. or even when the British are around. So, for example, you look at the famous Sarda Act, the Child Marriage Restraint Bill. So these are things that they were fighting for, not with an Indian nation state, but fighting against, or these were demands that were made from the colonial state itself. In the course of doing this, what they were also doing was galvanizing a number of demands that women's movement in India, or say even other feminists who are not men. I mean, I would say, beginning with Ram Mohan Roy's and Benting's reforms for against the sati, abolition of sati, Vidyasagar's reforms for the rights of widows, right? So all those various demands which were there in the public sphere in a piecemeal manner, some here, some there, they were all brought together. They were all galvanized. They were all crystallized together, and a number of such documents were prepared by the AIWC. I can cite, discuss them in details in the book, at least three documents that I cite in details in my book. One is the legislative program of the All India Women's Conference. So 1935-30 to 1937 is the period when AIWC has a very definite legislative program, and they make certain kind of demands from the legislators or people who are contesting the elections for the various legislative assemblies in India, that women will vote for you only if you can make very clear what is your position regarding these. So that is something that helped women of India become a kind of a constituency. So that started happening. The second document, which is absolutely brilliant and I think very, very radical even by contemporary standards, is the subcommittee's report on women's role in planned economy, which was prepared in 1939 when Nehru was the president of Congress, and Nehru and Subhas Bose, both of them, had jointly tried to start a national planning committee. So if you look at the committee's report, it had done extensive research in the condition, or the term is status of women in India. The actual socio-economic indicators on which women were found to be lagging far behind the men of the country. So that particular thing, and then what kind of role can women play in this? So that document is itself authored by a number of members of the AIWC who eventually became members of the Constituent Assembly. And finally, around 1945, the AIWC prepared, I think it's in its December 1945 session, they prepared Women's Charter of Rights and Duties, in which they made a number of demands about which are not actually just liberal demands plus also demands about the social and economic rights of women. So this is something that the AIWC was doing uh, along with its persistent conversation with organizations like the International Labour Organization and various other groups in the country. And in this particular manner, what they had actually created was a belief that women of this country constitute a minority, which had certain kinds of disabilities which are socially inflicted upon them, and they deserve a kind of protection from the Constitution of India, whatever the future Constitution of India will be like. So there was a very definite, I think, and a conscious attempt, almost teleologically designed attempt on the part of AIWC and its important leaders to become members of the Constituent Assembly and make sure that the future Constitution of India takes note of the entire activity that women have been engaged in over the last 2 decades.
This is actually very enlightening, Achyut. And the bit that you spoke in the beginning about the language of the Constitution and how the AIWC members clearly were conversing in a certain kind of language also is forcing me to tie this to a thought which you mentioned in chapter 3 of your book, which is titled Women's Moral Imaginary and Constitutional Politics. And over there you mention that there's a portion that talks about the strategies adopted by women members with respect to certain specific issues and how they were going to bargain with respect to certain issues. And I have a very specific example in mind. This is with respect to the idea around absolute estate for women and the need for an absolute right to property for women, which would not have been subject to any limitations or restrictions. And over there, when Renuka Ray is speaking about this right to an absolute estate, she's tackling two specific aspects. One is the right to an absolute estate, exactly that. And the second is the right to absolute equality in terms of inheritance between sons and daughters. So after certain advice from B.N. Rao, she decides to press on the former and let go, at least for the time being, of the latter. So that she could just navigate with the Constituent Assembly members as to the first right could be guaranteed. And this seemed like a very carefully worded bargain based on whatever I've read in that particular chapter. And there are examples of this in the book as well. When I looked through portions of the UCC as well as the Hindu Code Bill, when women members were dealing with some of these issues, they were clearly working alongside established societal norms, many of them patriarchal, before any compromise could be arrived at. So you also mentioned towards the end of your thoughts on the AIWC that there was this belief that women were a minority requiring a certain kind of protection. So the strategies that the women members were adopting to further women's rights, were they different from strategies that were being adopted by any other vulnerable group? What sort of differences were there, if any?
Oh, that's, I think, a question that needs more investigation than I have been able to do so far because I have focused only on women's strategies. But I
Yeah.
can tell you a few things about women's strategies and try and imagine what kind of strategies other groups have taken. For example, the Dalit groups. I mean,
Hmm.
people like Ambedkar. So Ambedkar's strategy was more of, I said, more of a spectacular kind of movement, right? Ambedkar would lead the Mahat Satyagraha. Ambedkar would challenge Gandhi in a very public manner. That is not a strategy that, and think of the two nation theory that was finally very important, which was taken up by the Muslim minority in the country, right? So those were strategies which were very, as I said, which were very, I say, not just spectacular, but which involved a lot of people, which involved a lot of confrontation, which involved a lot of sometimes even violent activating of the political forces behind them. Women, on the other hand, did not take that kind of a route. The first thing they did, I believe, and this is something that I believe is part of, at least up till the 1950s, part of Indian women's movement strategies, that they worked more through collaborations with men rather than through confrontation with men. So the example that you were yourself giving is an example of a collaboration between Renuka Ray and B.N. Rao.
B.N. Rao.
B.N. Rao's sister-in-law, Kitty Shiva Rao, was a great friend of Renuka Ray, by the way. And she was also an important member of the All India Women's Conference. And it was Kitty Shiva Rao who put Renuka Ray in touch with B.N. Rao. So what women were doing consistently was trying to find who are the more progressive or proto-feminist or feminist men in the country who wield a lot of power in public sphere. So if you look at even the Hindu Law Committee debates in which Renuka Ray was participating from 1941 to 1945, she was consistently arguing and writing letters to important men like B.C. Roy, Nehru, sometimes even Gandhi to seek their support. So this was a strategy that they had already understood, that we will not be able to antagonize, or we will not be able to get our things done if we antagonize the stronger section of men in this country. And also somewhere I think it was not an understanding of patriarchy as a very, black and white thing. They understood that among the patriarchs also there are people who can on certain issues be brought in to your side. So if you look at the notes of dissent that these women were writing in the Constituent Assembly, in the various committees, about which I hope we'll have more time to talk about, you'll see several of these notes of dissent were signed by Hansa Mehta, Amrit Kaur, and Meenu Masani. Sometimes they will have a kind of, you know, strategic partnership with Alladi Krishna Swami Iyer. So, so there were, and I devote an entire chapter, not a chapter actually, a section on women's close working relationship with B.R. Ambedkar himself.
Exactly. I was
Right.
just going to mention that you've devoted a certain section to it.
So this idea that the strategy that they had, which they were developing right from the constitutional politics of 1930s and 40s, was not to work by fighting people, but making sure that somebody puts across the ideas they wanted to be put across, no matter who that person is. As long as that thing has been accepted, as long as that particular idea is put in circulation in the wider matrix and corridors of power, the work was done. So that was one of the important strategies. And if you allow me, I can just talk about one very smart strategy, as I would say, that the women members
Please.
took in the
Please,
Constant
Arjun.
Assembly, and
Yes.
which is also very important in the light of the first comment that you made, that the Constant Assembly is not a monolith. One
Yeah.
also has to understand that even the Constitution was not framed in one day.
Of
The
course.
Constitution was framed over a period of 3 years. Some articles were framed before other articles were framed. And the moment an article was framed, it already had a kind of a binding authority on the rest of the debate. So there was a kind of dialectic of a part of the Constitution upon which an agreement has already been reached, and a part of the Constitution about which more discussions had to be done.
Right.
So throughout the discussions, women made it clear or made a point to make sure that whenever a debate is being done, they could refer back to the decisions that have already been taken, thereby evoking or making these men, the large masculine male force in the Constant Assembly, complicit in the kind of decisions that they were taking. So they would say that you have already decided on this, so you cannot go back on that. And that is already a part of the Constitution. You have said that there will be right to equality. Now how can you make an exception for this? So this was a strategy that I think they had started working on from the 1920s 30s, when they would evoke something which had already been decided, which has already been endorsed by the state, and then say, if you have endorsed this, then why don't you do this? So building upon smaller victories,
Right.
okay, to reach to a larger victory. That was one of the strategies that I believe worked very well for the women members of the Constitution.
And I think also coming from a purely numerical point of view, I think that sort of strategy would have definitely worked
Absolutely,
because, yeah, this
absolutely.
sort of
Yeah. They
strategy
knew
would
that there were just 8 or 9 people here, so yeah,
exactly, exactly. There were 8 or 9 people who are severely outnumbered by the male members of the
absolutely,
assembly. So,
absolutely.
and you've already spoken about the committees. So at this point, I think it would be good to also spend some time just talking about the committees under the Constituent Assembly, because one of the standout aspects for me, as was the prominent role women members played in the various committees and subcommittees of the Constituent Assembly. And the reach of their impact can perhaps be best ascertained from their participation in the committees. Again, I think for the benefit of our viewers, I should just mention what these committees were. What are we talking about here? The Constituent Assembly appointed several committees, 22 in number, Achyut, I think, if I'm
Yes,
not mistaken, to deal with different tasks of constitution making. So some of the most prominent ones were the drafting committee, the Union Powers Committee, Union Constitution Committee, and then there was also the advisory committee on fundamental rights, minorities, and tribal and excluded areas. So this was the advisory committee, which had subcommittees on fundamental rights, minorities, and for tribal areas. And these subcommittees were the ones which saw immense participation, very, very constructive participation by women. And the assembly was, yes, of course, the expanse of all the members in the assembly who would debate, which is where the Constituent Assembly debates come from. The committees were smaller groups convening to discuss certain specific matters in more detail, in greater detail. Of course, and these were perhaps one of the fora where the women were most vocal. And some of the most standout aspects of women's participation for me are within the committee as well. I think one of the most important issue that I would like to highlight here, and Achyut, you can speak about this in more detail, is when Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta are talking about the breadth of the right to freedom of religion. So are we to be guaranteed a broad right to freedom of religion, which also brings within its expanse all the socially liberal practices that religion sanction? Or do we have a more narrow right to worship? So the kind of exchange that happens where sometimes both women are speaking in solidarity and sometimes even speaking for each other, that part really stands out for me. One other thing, actually, that's very, very important for me, and this sort of distinction I kept making in my mind while I was reading this book. Sometimes we also tend to talk about the contribution of women members in the making of the constitution, where perhaps we should be talking about the authorship of women members. They weren't contributing, they were writing this. They clearly were not contributing to a bigger project that was the constitution making. So, Achyut, your thoughts on the entire committee system? Where do we locate the most important, the most substantial interventions made by women? And how do we approach this from a structural composition point of view, with a larger masculine constituent assembly, with smaller groups where perhaps women would feel more comfortable or more confident participating? Your thoughts on that, Achyut?
Precisely. I mean, I completely agree with you. And there are historical, like archival evidences when women are saying that we felt more comfortable working in a small committee where we could tell what we want to say without any fear of being, nudged or heckled by other people. While in the Constituent Assembly, this is something that I write in more vivid manner in one of my chapters. Before we talk about the committee, I just want the audience to think of the Parliament of India. And if you think of the Parliament of India, not one of the small committees of the Parliament of India, think of the entire Parliament in session and think of 300, 400 people sitting in the Parliament. And along with apart from the members, also the bureaucrats, the journalists, the cameras that are watching. What we see now, unfortunately, is the fact that it's a kind of like everybody who is sitting in the Parliament has a microphone right before them in the Parliament hall. Nowadays, we have such beautifully designed auditoriums, boardrooms, committee rooms everywhere. But the Parliament of India, the Parliament Hall, the central library building where the Constituent Assembly used to meet, did not have such microphones. So for a woman to speak in an assembly like that would mean to walk through the well of the entire Constituent Assembly and reach the stage, right, and go. There was only two podiums. So one was occupied by the magisterial high seat of the president of the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, with 15 other bureaucrats sitting below him. He had one microphone, and there was only one other microphone where you have to go stand up and then hold it and then speak. So you can imagine the kind of male gaze, the kind of power dynamics of the architecture of this whole thing, walking there and then going and making a speech. Even if you wanted to say something, maybe it was difficult for you to throw your voice with the full authenticity, full conviction that you have. As opposed to that, if you're sitting in a committee, you are sitting in a round table and you have brought your papers, you have brought your documents, you are saying something in a low voice, people are listening to you directly. You do not have to force yourself to say something. Somebody who's sitting next to you, maybe imagine Hansa Ray and Amrit Kaur sitting next to each other. They can even consult each other. So you make this point, I'll make this point. They have done their homework because there is already, as you know, committees work through agenda. So there is already an agenda that tomorrow in the committee we are going to discuss this. So you already have a homework done. You know your strategy. You know the documents that you are going to cite. In a smaller committee, you have already made solidarities with people. They may be men, they may be women. So you already know that in a committee. I mean, I work in an administrative capacity in my university. I know I have some friends with who I always discuss things before we go to a meeting. So
that identified your allies in the committee.
Absolutely, you have your allies, and so that was something that made the working of women in the committees, I think, more effective. But that's just the performance part of it. The more important part of this, I believe, is for our audience, it is important to remember that the Constituent Assembly worked through several stages. And the first stage of the making of the Constitution was actually asking all these committees to prepare their reports, their suggestions. And those suggestions were then given to the drafting committee. And on the basis of that, the drafting committee prepared a draft. I'm also missing the fact that B.N. Rao had made a draft even before the committees had given their own suggestions. So we had several drafts of the Constitution which were prepared through these committees even before the Constituent Assembly debates started happening. So what would you debate on? You debate on a particular article, right? So those articles were actually drafted in the committees. So I don't have an empirical or data analysis of this, but I can safely say that 70% of what was decided in the committees was left unchanged by the debates of the Constituent Assembly, right? So the most important work of the Constituent Assembly was already done in the committee. That's one thing. The other important thing is the committees work through consensus rather than a voting system. So you did not have to raise your hand to say how many yes and how many no's. So it's just that you work through a consensus, and that helps. So I think the committees were very important, and women were aware of the role that the committees are going to play in the making the constitution. In 1946, when the AIWC was floating a name of 45 women, trying to or canvassing for them for the election into the Constituent Assembly, they were even suggesting among themselves that even if we do not get any seat in the Constituent Assembly, let us try to get at least one or two of us on some of these committees, especially the Fundamental Rights Committee or the Advisory Committee. So I think the committee part is, I call them the inner chamber of the Constituent Assembly, where the important decisions were taken. And then the debates were just a kind of, performance or giving people that scoop that, okay, you also speak.
In fact, once we, after reading your book and after spending some time with it, once we go back to some of the deliberations in the committees, when you realize that the wealth of the contribution of the women members of the Constituent Assembly is actually to be found in the committees. But I think it also has to do with the way we end up reading the framing of the Constitution. A lot of us are going through the debates, but perhaps we're not spending as much time with what goes into the committees or what went into the proceedings of the committee. I think we have still gotten used to reading this book by B. Shivarao, which the multi-volume framing of India's Constitution, which is all the deliberations, all the proceedings, and the minutes of the committees. But I can definitely imagine myself going through some of the older minutes that I've read already with a new perspective, with a new developed understanding. Having said that, Achyut, I think we could also maybe speak about some of the specific interventions of women members on certain specific issues. And one thought that I latched on to concerns the evolving ideologies of the women members themselves. Because as we just said, we are perhaps talking of some of the women members being part of the All India Women's Conference as well. They've clearly spent some time with engaging in politics at that time, and then they've spent about 2.5 to 3 years in the Constituent Assembly. So in all of these years, their own ideologies, their own perspectives towards certain issues have also changed. And there could have been certain marked shifts in their own ideologies and the way they think. In light of this thought, would you like to comment on two specific issues that came up for intense discussion in the assembly? One was the Uniform Civil Code, and the other was the Hindu Code Bill, which advocated reform for several Hindu laws such on marriage, inheritance, succession, adoption, and things like that. So, any thoughts on that, on the evolving ideology of women members on these specific interventions?
Many thoughts on that, actually. But before that, a small comment on what you said just before. There's a very important point that you made about not using the word contribution, and instead of using that word, using the word authoring. Right. So when we think of contribution, we look at what is it that you have contributed, right? So which part of the Constitution is, written by the women or by this person or that person? That actually takes away. I think it's a very unsubtle way or non-nuanced way of understanding how power operates in parliamentary proceedings. You do not explicitly, directly find something that I have said here, and you don't find a corresponding something in the Constitution of India. That particular way of looking at the Constitution and the Constituent Assembly debates itself, I think, is a very narrow way of looking at the Constitution. What we need to do is to read the entirety of the Constituent Assembly debates and whatever was being said by whoever was a member of the Constituent Assembly, even outside the Constituent Assembly, in different roles, in consonance with each other. It's like a discursive unity. Like we need to find the cross references. So this is precisely why I thought that to talk about the Uniform Civil Code without talking about the Hindu Code Bill, or to talk about the Hindu Code Bill without talking about the Uniform Civil Code, is probably not going to work. We need to work on these two together. And when we talk about women's, the example that you were giving, limiting the jurisdiction of religious forces in this country, right? Article 25. So whether there should be free practice of religion or not, that was the word to which women had raised an objection. So if you think of religion, Hindu Code Bill, Uniform Civil Code, we need to bring all of them together. The idea of secularization, which they were promoting in their role as social reformers, right? All of them have to be brought together in order to get an ideological or let's say authorial intention of these women. What happens to that intention is another question. Whether they could really get that intention framed in the constitution is another thing, because, as I said, power doesn't work like that. So maybe they made a small dent here, another small dent there. Maybe they just inflected a little bit of the language of the Constituent Assembly, and so on. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Uh, the question of Hindu Code Bill, I think, is very, very important. There are four examples that I will give you. I mean, historical events that were happening together. I have brought them together in the reading of in my reading, but I'm not giving the entire detail out here. I request the audience to read up the book to get that idea. One is, for example, a very important thing that is to be noted is this is happening in 1947 when we are having refugee camps on both sides of the border. Hindu camps, Muslim camps, Sikh camps. There are regular reports of violence against women of another community. These communities are now being redefined as communities from another nation. The other is now being replaced, right? A lot of violence is perpetrated against women, women as daughters-in-law, right? This is something that's happening here. I also have in mind somewhere a very veiled but not so veiled reference to the kind of discourse we have in this country against love jihad, right? And in the Constituent Assembly, women are making a specific demand in the Fundamental Rights Committee that we should make it a fundamental right for anybody to choose a partner from another community. Inter-community marriages should be part of the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution. So that is happening on the one hand. On the other hand, you have this uh, at least 10-year-old, 15-year-old debate around the Hindu Code Bill. Now, that is not that's just the tip of the iceberg. Reforms in Hindu law and also Muslim law have been happening for the last 200 years or longer than that. But whether we should have a code is another big debate. So, do we need to codify all of them together, all these various piecemeal legislations together, is another thing. When we do this, where do we take the ideal aspects from? So the term that they use, uh, uh, I think, is very important. The term they use is common civil code rather than uniform civil code. So what they are trying to do, the women members of the Constituent Assembly, are trying to build upon what is already there, right, and find the common progressive elements from there. The fear that contemporary feminists have, and probably rightly so, is that if you start the exercise of framing and uniform civil code in this country, it will be the civil code based on the majority group of this country. But that is not happening here because women have already been very anxious about majoritarianism, right? So they are picking up common things from smaller communities, quote unquote, the subaltern or lower caste communities. Hindus can take from Muslim communities, Muslims can take from Hindu communities, and so on. So this bringing together of all communities together, the progressive ideas of the various communities, along with a big project of secularization of education, hoping that at some point education will create a modern Indian citizen for whom religion will not be the reference point for everything that is now part of the personal law. So one has to read all of them together to understand women's position on any of these issues. Just as you said, I mean, I'm avoiding picking up a particular contribution here, saying that this is, or if there was a contribution, this is how women inflected the discussions of the Constituent Assembly, bringing in the lived experience of women in the larger frame of their politics of secularization, their politics of nation building, but not a nation building based on an ethnic understanding of a nation with a past, but nation building on the understanding of a modern citizen who can contribute as you who can play a role in the economy of this country. So these are some of the things. The other thing that you asked was evolution. Just one example, and maybe I will shut up on this. Because one particular argument that was made when women started demanding their rights, uh, say, for example, the right to work or the right to recognize the homemaker's economic contribution to the family,
Mhm.
right? So initially, sometime until 1930s, late 1930s, the demand is made on the basis of women's right because women have a right because women contribute to the economy. Okay.
Correct.
So there is a kind of a utilitarian argument that is being made. So women contribute, so you need to give something back to them. Imagining the nation as an economy. By the time they come to the Constituent Assembly, that has taken a much more liberal shape. And they're saying even if they don't contribute, or whether they contribute or not is not important. The significant thing is that they are also citizens. And as citizens, it is an inalienable right, no matter what utility they serve for the nation or not, right? Until 1930s and even in the beginning of 1940s, there were some references to some kind of an ulticarian paradigm of the glorious Indian, culture. But by 1950s or even late 1940s, that reference has been totally erased. In the
Correct.
Constituent Assembly, you will hardly find any woman saying that in India women ever had a glorious past, right? Because they are now basing their arguments on the basis of socio-economic indicators, what is later on called the status of women, the actual status of women. So it's a very secularized debate towards which women are themselves moving. By 1961, as I end one of my chapters, women are already saying that there is no biological, natural, essential difference between men and women. Right? It is only socially induced. So there's a lot of evolution in their own ideology, in their own feminist thinking, in their political strategies, and what they expect from the country.
Yeah, that's very helpful to know. And the one thing that, I mean, you've spoken about the Uniform Civil Code already, but one thing that really stayed with me when you wrote about the UCC was how the women members were approaching the question of a UCC. And this is just going to be my last observation, after which we could just take a couple of questions from the audience. And this occurs in chapter 6, perhaps, if I recall correctly. But the women members were looking at the UCC as a means of achieving a universalization of rationality in the field of social laws. So it wasn't, I mean, it definitely may have concerned some kind of uniformity, but not uniformity to the erasure of all sort of personal laws, but to bring a common standard of rationality when it came to social laws, by merging diversity of laws into conformity with one another. So that, I think, that was a standout point for me here, and I'm
Um,
glad. Yeah.
I go back to the word rational. It's in 1932, I think, as a member of the Bombay Municipal Legislature. I'm forgetting the exact name of this organization, where Hansa Mehta makes this demand that we need to find a rational definition of what is marriage. Okay, and that is and the redefinition of marriage has to be built on understanding has to be built on understanding or acknowledging that men and women are equal. They are complementary. Both of them have independent, autonomous legal rights. Marriage is also the foundation of family, but not marriage cannot just be treated as a foundation of family. One has to think of something. Marriage is also as a choice of two people to stay together, right? I am also deliberately saying this because at this point we are having a debate on same-sex marriage in this
Exactly.
country. So
Mhm.
that is there. You look at the note of dissent written by Kapila Khandewal in the uh, Women's Role in Planned Economy report, and she very vigorously argues that we do not need to think of the modern family only as a family of a father, a mother, and a child, but you can think of family in a very different manner. Ansa Mehta also, I'm just informing the audience here, as a member of the committee for the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Rights of Man, uh, UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sorry. She actually made it a point, and it is through her, it is because of her intervention that there is this article, the UDHR says that a human being, an individual, is the fundamental unit of the society. Whereas the UDHR people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, had a draft called "The family will be the basic unit of the society." Right. So from the very beginning, Mehta, Hansa Mehta onwards, there has been a consistent rationalization of this debate, and family is not considered as the basic unit of the nation or of the community. One other example that I'll give, which kind substantiate what do these women mean when they say that we need to have a rationalization of this, is when there was this debate on the adoption policy. No, uh, Ambedkar's draft of the Hindu Code bill did not allow for a provision for adoption of daughters. And Mehta intervened and said, no, why should you adopt only sons and not adopt daughters, right? Daughter and sons both should be adopted. And the argument she is making is on the basis of on her critique of this notion that adoption is a religious thing in Hindu law. You adopt a son because the son has the right to do the funeral things, and the son is someone who will look after the afterlife of the father and mother and so on. And that is so she's this is the rationality, right? Trying to uh, trying to inform every single debate on whatever issue by the principles of equality and equity whenever possible. So that is how I thought they worked on this rationalization. When the code, when the Uniform Civil Code or Common Civil Code was to be made, they also made a point, because that this has to be an optional code. This cannot be a code like the Special Marriage Act. This cannot be a
Right.
code which will be imposed on people. Let people have the choice to declare whether they want to be governed by this code or not, thereby not just rationalizing this thing, but also allowing for a democratic exercise of your
Exactly.
own choice of what legal jurisdiction you want to be a part of. I think that, uh,
That sort of
yeah,
contextualizes the discussions around the UCC as well. We could just take a couple of questions that I can see here, Achyut, and I'm actually going to piggyback on one of these questions because I had one of my own, which is very similar to that. So, oh, so what was how did the personal like life experiences of the women members of the Constituent Assembly, how did that inform their views and thoughts on some of the issues that were being debated in the assembly? And Achal, maybe we could talk about that in the specific context of maybe Dakshayani Velayudhan, because she was a woman member, one of those people who was not a member of the All India Women's Conference, was the sole member who was a sole woman member who was part of a scheduled caste, and she had very specific, very strong views on separate electorates, reservations, the prohibition on untouchability. So perhaps we could address that question in the context of Dakshayani and talk about her lived experiences and her views on specific issues.
absolutely, absolutely. Maybe a few things about that shiny need to be told and retold again and again. But before that, I just want to say that all these women had exceptional personal experiences.
Yes.
All of these women were uh, radical even in their personal lives,
Hmm.
right?
And a
So
lot of this actually comes up in chapter 2 also, in which you've
yes,
spoken
so
about a
they
lot of
were
these
not,
women.
and that is one reason why they were also hated. There were like concerted efforts to scuttle the appointment of these women to the Constituent Assembly. For example, because we have been talking about Renuka Ray, uh, the uh, the president of the All India Hindu Women's Mahasabha, which was the women's wing of the Hindu Mahasabha, Janki Bai Joshi, uh, actually wrote to Lord Wavell and to the cabinet mission that Renuka Ray should not be elected to the Constituent Assembly because she will destroy the fabric of Indian culture and so on. There was a lot of resistance to even Hansa Mehta's election to the Constituent Assembly. So it's not that these women, Renuka Ray, Hansa Mehta was married to G. Viraj Mehta. It was a pratilom marriage at that time. It was a marriage of choice that they had done, which had caused a huge furor in their personal lives also. Amrit Kaur had never married, and that also was a kind of a non-normative life that she, embodied in herself. So all these women, Durga Bai, I would do an injustice if I don't talk about Durga Bai. Durga Bai was a victim of child marriage. So she was married when she was just 12 years old to a boy who was 13 years old. And she told her husband, this 13-year-old boy, as a precocious girl, that you please move on. I don't want to be with you. And she did a kind of an informal divorce as a teenager. And then she worked with the sex workers in the south, and brought them into the fold of Satyagraha and Gandhi's movement. So all of these women, and she was an exceptional. She was single by that logic. So all of these women had exceptional lived
And she had a
experience.
thriving practice apparently in the
And
Madras
she
High
had a
Court also.
thriving practice, absolutely. When
Even
Durgabai was
Madras.
elected to the Constituent Assembly, I think I've written about that. She was one of the most promising lawyers in the Madras High Court, and the lawyers and her judges and colleagues would say, "Why are you wasting your time by going to the Constituent Assembly and doing that work rather than that? Continue doing your practice here." So these were all exceptional women, but yes, of course, Dakshayani's case is particularly very important. And since I've already said that all women have to face a resistance in getting elected to the Constituent Assembly,
Right.
I choose the example of Dakshayani particularly because that brings in all the fault lines against which these women had to fight in order to get elected to the Constituent Assembly. So Dakshayani was from Kerala. She was from Travancore and Kochi. She contested the election to the Constituent Assembly from the Madras province. She fought against a man who was the mayor of Madras at that point, who was a leader of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation and a very important barrister himself. He was a Dalit man, an elite Dalit man. Often I've been asked by people that these women were all elite, right? So I can only say to them that they were probably elite, but they were not elitist, number one. And everybody in the Constituent Assembly was some way or the other, in some sense or the other, elite. So Dakshayani had to contest against this man, and there were vitriolic attacks on her on all sides. So the All India Scheduled Caste Federation and the Dalit groups within Madras constituency opposed her election. They wrote to Ambedkar, they wrote to within themselves. One of these men actually sat on a fast unto death, saying she should not be elected to the Constituent Assembly. Dakshayani also in the past, in her course, she was this 32-year-old young woman, the first Dalit woman to get a bachelor's degree in science in India, and she wanted to become a member of the Constituent Assembly. So she was, you can understand, she was extremely strong in her voice. So she had criticized Raja Gopalachari, the doyen of South Indian politics at that point. She had made critical remarks about Patel, about Nehru, and everyone, of course, also Ambedkar. So there were resistances to her election in the Constituent Assembly from the Congress members. Also, there was resistance to her getting elected in the on regional lines. So here is a person from a Malayalam speaking person. Why should she be elected from Madras? So all kinds of things, and eventually she got elected by a very small margin of 1 or 2 votes in the Constituent Assembly. So Dakshayani's example is very important to remember because here is a woman who is very independent minded. She was not a member of the All India Women's Conference. She got elected to the Constituent Assembly independently, maybe with some interventions of the Congress people because they saw that here is a Dalit woman who is not in sync with Ambedkar, could be a reason. But even in the Constituent Assembly, she did not spare anyone and would criticize the assembly members for all kinds of things, including her own female colleagues. This example is also important because on the question of reservations, on the question of joint electorates, she opposed Ambedkar and sided with the women. But on the question of reservations, she opposed Ambedkar and sided with the women members. So it's not that she belonged to any one community. She could choose her, she could speak her own mind. Uh, in the Constituent Assembly, she comes across as a woman who is a dedicated socialist. Someone among all the women there, she is probably the most vocal against the rise of Hindu communalism in the Constituent Assembly, against RSS, and the kind of communal virus that she thought was plaguing Indian machinery. She also did not. She had a very independent thought about the annihilation of caste, thinking that intercaste marriage may not be the best solution to that because that sustains the idea of caste, right? So it might reinforce the caste system if people do marry or intermarry, looking at the class benefits that a marriage can bring in. Her position on untouchability was also very, I think, interesting, because she did not agree that untouchability should be made a punishable crime.
Punishment,
Instead of
exactly.
that, we should think of untouchability as a social evil, and it has to be through education that we can fight that, rather than discussing, presenting this as a crime. So, dark Chinese example, I thought, is uh, to my mind, is an example of, oh, okay, and I'm sorry, the last example which I thought is very important is dark Chinese own interventions during the factory bill, when she opposes women from the quote unquote elite group on the question of women's labor and women's safety, who work in the night shifts, for example. So Dakshine is one of the few women in the Constituent Assembly, an example which can tell how women were independent, nobody's puppet, and also the example that they could introduce certain discourses in an implied manner in the Constituent Assembly. For example, the issue of sexual violence, which was not very important there. So when she talks about the night shift for women, she was probably referring to the kind of violence that women can be subject
Sure. This is actually, sorry, Achit,
to.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
you were
no,
saying
I'm done.
something.
Yeah.
But this is the position, the discourse around, and whatever you've written about Dakshayani is actually it's been rather enlightening, because there's so much to her, to her election to the Constituent Assembly, that is worth going back to. So much about her interventions. There's just one other question in the chat box that I'm going to take, and maybe after that we could close the discussion. There's a question around any specific areas that saw very little intervention from women. So, for instance, I think in the book we've covered a lot about what areas definitely saw intervention by women: the Hindu Code Bill, the Uniform Civil Code, issues concerning fundamental right and religion. But were there any specific areas that saw very little? Oh, I was just about to say contribution, but very little intervention by the women. Were there any such areas?
I'd rather give a provocative answer to this, because I write in the introduction of my book that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And this book is not an exhaustive record of all the things that women have said in the Constitution. I mean, I've chosen some of the most important ones, but there are many. For example, women's contribution to the idea of independent judiciary,
Right.
women's opposition to a very strong centralized state, and some women were for centralized state, women's opposition to conscription, women's contribution to the national language question, right? So these were also things in which women participated. I have not mentioned, and I have not been able to do enough research on that. But then, of course, there could have been issues on which women have not spoken very much. I am not very sure of that. So you see, the Constituent Assembly in the Indian Constitution actually talks about nearly everything that touches our life.
Exactly.
So to expect that 8 or 9 women would have spoken about everything is also probably not a very practical kind of
Not a
expectation.
very
But
practical
I would
experience.
say that they nearly intervene in all kinds of debates. Uh, One has to still go back to the archives to find uh, more evidences of their intervention. Sometimes they did it through other people, and hence maybe we will never be able to know whether they did it or not. 1947 and 1950, in this period, Indian women, of course, were not very aware of intellectual property rights and plagiarism and so on. So they would be very happy if you take up their issue, and they would sit quietly in the committee. So we'd never even know that this idea came to the Constant Assembly, or they had introduced, or one of the women members had introduced and introduced. I would say this, yeah. But the question that was asked here, maybe sexual violence was not something that was taken up so directly by them, which became a very important issue in Indian feminist movement in the 1980s and 90s. Was probably not that clear. Uh, I would also a methodological point that I would like to make here is uh, to appreciate the fact that in the making of the constant in the making of the constitution, or during the debates in the Constituent Assembly, most of the issues that were discussed were very abstract issues. So there were not a direct, material correlative of a principle that was being discussed here. I believe women thought that these will later on be activated once the constitution is implemented. And so there would be various issues about which they did not probably specifically speak, but they hoped that at some point, maybe us, we will start speaking about those issues which they had in their mind, consciously or unconsciously.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, Achal. And the one big takeaway I have from the last response that you just gave us was to go back to the archives and perhaps not stop the investigation here. There should be an ongoing investigation about the extent of women's role, women members' role in the framing of the Constitution. Just one last point from me, and this actually came up in a conversation Achyut and you and I were having outside of this particular event, was how we definitely recognize the contribution of a lot of these women members, but not as members of the Constituent Assembly who were crucial to the drafting of the Constitution. We remember Amrit Kaur as the Minister of Health and Family Welfare, Sucheta Kriplani as the former Chief Minister of UP, Durga Vai Deshmukh as somebody with a thriving practice in Madras. But the point about them being very crucial components of the drafting of the Constitution is somehow lost. And I fully go back after this conversation with the thought that we need to go back to the archives and keep this ongoing investigation, or let it not die down. But thank you so much for your time. Achyut, your work is a timely, I will have to say, contribution at this point. It's a timely contribution on the role of the women members of the Constituent Assembly. I've read the book once, but I definitely feel like going back to some specific parts of it because they're rather intriguing to me, and I would maybe go down several rabbit holes while looking at some of those points. Thanks very much, Achyut, for your time. I wish we could continue this conversation for a longer time. You were saying something, Achyut.
No, I would just like to thank you again, and this is a wonderful opportunity I got, and I hope the audience has found some reasons. As I say, I'm one of the things that I mentioned in the book is the book was waiting to be written. Anybody else could have written that, and I think there are a lot of things that are waiting to be discovered in the archives, and not just for historical knowledge, but for the better health of this republic. So just taking on from what you said, these were not just framers of the Indian Constitution. To evoke the title of the book, they were founding mothers of the Indian Republic. And of course, I use the word founding mothers within quotes, but it's the entire republic that I believe is obliged to look back at what they have done and take up the project that they had started. It's still unfinished. And we need to go back to the Constitution with a new perspective, maybe, and see if it is possible for us to take the fight that they had started. Sometime in 1980s, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay was very upset in remembering, or was very upset to and lamented that their contribution, or what the kind of struggle that they had gone through, is not even remembered by the current generation. So she was saying this in 1981 or 82. So I think 2023, we still have not been sufficiently grateful, I would say, to these women. There is also, I believe, something that we can take from these women as feminists who could work together, cutting across communities, regions, and other things. There is also an international dimension to their work on the Constituent Assembly. There's a very important dimension to their contribution to the human rights debate, to which the Indian Constitution also contributes a lot through these women. I think so. There are a lot of things that I hope we will be able to continue in this conversation with the country. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for such probing questions and your own insights, which have enriched my own thinking on this issue. Thank you so much.
The pleasure is entirely ours, Achyut. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks also to everyone who's joined us via Zoom, as well as the ones who are watching the live stream on YouTube. Please keep following Vidhi social media handles for more events like this. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you everyone for joining in. Have a lovely evening. Thanks everyone. Thanks Preeti, and thanks Atul for being with us for the sign language interpretation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.